This time in the Magic Kitchen, we are joined by author and teacher from the Temple of Witchcraft, Christopher Penczak.
I'm Leandra Witchwood.
And I'm Elise Wells.
And welcome to the Magic Kitchen podcast, where we talk about magic, kitchen witchcraft, herbs,
and everything in between.
As you may know, the Magic Kitchen podcast is fully and independently funded by the Witchwood Tea House. So show us some support and head over to thewitchwoodteahouse.com to purchase some deliciously hand-blended loose-leaf teas or one of my other botanical products. As a special thank you for your support, please use POD15 at checkout to take 15% off of your next order. So without any further ado, let's get to the episode. Blessed be. So we are at the end of October already. I can't believe this year has gone so fast. We were just talking about this the other day when we got together.
Yeah, I'm in the U.S.
The cloister. Yes, yes.
It was fun. We went to Ephrata and we got Panera. And
we did. We hung out.
It was fun. It was nice. We got to enjoy the fall weather together.
Oh my gosh. It was a beautiful day. It was so great.
Mm-hmm.
Gotta do that more.
Mm-hmm. I know.
more.
We went to a sacred site. We went to the Ephrata Cloister, which is, I actually was going to have my wedding there. And then they didn't allow food. And there was like a whole situation with like figuring out a place to drive everyone to. And so we decided not to go with it. But it's a really cool place. And I encourage people to think broader about what sacred sites are, because the cloister is a perfect example. Like, it was a place where religiously persecuted Germans went to live. And they were Anabaptists, which means that they believed that adults should choose to join the church, not children.
Yes.
Which I respect. Children. I really respect that. And they also had these individuals at this place we went to, the Ephrata Cloister. They had a really different view of things than other Anabaptists. Like, the Amish are Anabaptists, Mennonites are Anabaptists. They were different. They were weird too, you know, like there's a strangeness to these
culty
cults, but they had some good points. So like, on one hand, they made them all wear the same white little ghosty sheet thing. It did not look flattering on anybody. And then on the other hand, they believed that you shouldn't use animals for food or for work or labor because they can't consent to it. So they were like 50% there, you know what I mean? Like, they were throwing the darts and hitting the bullseye every so often.
They're almost there.
Yeah. So I just love it.
It was definitely extreme, we had this discussion while we were there, like the idea that your entire day is regimented and planned out for you. Like, and I'm exploring that right now for my spiritual practice, because they spent how many hours a day? 2, 3, like 5 hours a day in spiritual reflection, in spiritual meditation and prayer. And they still got their work done. Like, think about it. This is back 1790?
32.
It was
it was 1732
really
until 1813.
Yes,
when
and then
they were there because they were celibate, so no one knew what was coming. And then they sort of like evolved beyond that. And I think overall probably just joined the general Mennonite community after that, because Lancaster County, PA, is known for the Mennonites and the Amish.
Really? Yeah, definitely. And think about it, like, they had to make everything from scratch. So that's time consuming, right? But they still got all of these chores, quote unquote, air quotes, chores done, and still spent 5 hours in spiritual practice.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about this the whole time. I'm like, well, okay, maybe I need to restructure my day so I can spend more time in my spiritual practice. And it's not always possible. I'm not going to spend 5 hours meditating, praying. But if I can squeeze in another 10 minutes, cool. But I think it was that we had this discussion about decision fatigue. Like, they didn't have to make a decision. And I think decision fatigue kills most of us. Like, we just can't make another freaking decision.
Yeah.
What's for dinner? I don't freaking know. I'll order something,
Yep.
so that type of thing. So I'm really starting to hone in, especially, we're at the end of 2024. 2025 is right around the corner. It's that time to like reevaluate and restructure things that aren't working. So that's what I'm doing right now. I'm spending this whole time within my practice, within my work, within my businesses, restructuring things, which is good because I'm about to launch a really intensive initiation program. And I haven't spoken much about this because it's still in the planning stages, but I'm hoping to get it off the ground 2025, the beginning. So it's called the Gardens of the Mystic. And this is going to be a very structured program because what I'm hearing from my community, what I'm hearing from people who attended the summit that was just this month, people are lacking structure. There's so much knowledge out there. There's so many people telling you what to do, how to do it, when to do it, why to do it, how to, where to do it. And it's confusing. And I agree because I've done the same thing. Like I've gone down the rabbit hole of like productivity and everybody's telling you how to be productive and they all have their own way of doing it. And so which one do you choose? So I'm developing this program where you're literally going to be initiated through these gardens. And each garden is an immersive experience where we're going to dive into very occult, esoteric topics that are honed in for each garden. So this is enriching, immersive environment where we're going to do projects. We're going to do meditations. We're going to do rituals. We're going to do all this stuff that helps you understand that esoteric knowledge, that esoteric topic. And then once you're done with the program, if you've gone through the whole program with me, then I'm going to give you a charter to take this program to go teach it to your community, to bring people in your area, because that's the other aspect that I'm hearing a lot of is that there's nothing in your area that will help you develop spiritually. And so this whole program is taking my Wiccan side, my structured ceremonial magic side, and melding it with my shamanic witch side, the herbal side. So we're going to talk about herbalism. We're going to talk about how to blend your own perfumes. We're going to talk about documenting your journey. We're going to talk about poison garden, the garden of the dead. So there's all these gardens that I'm developing. So I'm really hoping that you guys are excited about it because I'm super excited.
Yeah.
I can't wait for it. It's going to be a huge program. So that's in the works. That's what I'm up to.
That's gorgeous. It's interesting because that's exactly where I think we're all being called to go. I have good and bad news. The workshop that just passed, the Spiral Path, is the last online workshop I'll be doing for a while. It's the last one-off workshop. Because I too, my students, my clients, I have the Sacred Wild membership where we meet twice a month for guidance. And in that as well, like this is the kind of conversation on Patreon. It's the conversation in my DMs, on my comments on Instagram. It is about structure. People feel really unmoored and lost.
Yes.
And even through the Spiral Path, that workshop was about teaching you how to raise energy. And it was interesting, like, to realize how little that's the part we talk about. People know what witchcraft should look like, mostly. Even that, they're like, I've never seen a full ritual. I've never participated in this or that. Or like, there's just not a lot of experiential opportunities out there. And I have launched, and I'm shifting away from these one-off workshops for this reason. I am now focusing on containers, on programs, on building out classes that become a safe space for growth while providing a structured framework.
Yeah.
Removing that decision fatigue, but also encouraging accountability. Because I'll be honest, I want to go deeper too. Like the one-off workshops, you never know who's going to come. Sometimes we do have, like, I have some regulars who come to every workshop, and they're the ones who have really inspired me to put together the witch codes. And that's it. The witch codes is open, and early bird ends the 31st of October. We begin November 4th, and we will meet every Monday at 7 p.m. EST for 90 minutes to experience witchcraft. And this class is informed by my master's degree studying the modern history of witchcraft. It's informed by the years of study and travel to sacred sites that I've engaged in. It's inspired by my priestesshood. I'm a high priestess in the eclectic fairy tradition. And this is the first course that I'm opening to share that knowledge openly and honestly. And I'm hoping it will grow into a wider priestess training. I have a lot of people asking me for it, and it's just not time. My guides are telling me it's not time yet. So this container is that chance to get to know me, get to see what is behind the veil. And if you're listening and you're like a little spooked by it, but intrigued, that's exactly the feeling you should have about witchcraft. Yeah. There needs to be like, so many people are like, oh, but is witchcraft safe? Should it be safe? Should it be easy? You know, and we're even lazy. Like people are like, oh, I just like being a lazy witch. And I'm like, having less bells and whistles doesn't mean you're lazy. Being a lazy witch is a different thing. I am not here for people who don't want to actually raise energy. I'm here for the people who want to raise the energy, who want to create the spell jar and look at it on their desk and know I am powerful. Yes. And if you're a little bit afraid of your power, you're exactly the person who's supposed to be stepping into it, because that is patriarchy telling you that power is dangerous, power is scary, power corrupts, power makes you evil, power this, power that. None of those things are true, because you know that you don't want that out of it. And that means you're the person meant to have it. You know, we think about like the way people who are pushed into leadership versus the ones who seek it every moment of their lives. Who would you rather have the leader be? And that's what witchcraft is. You become a leader of yourself.
Yeah, the unlikely leader. Yeah.
And we find that internal motivation instead of the external. We find that internal validation instead of the external. And most importantly, that becomes our intuition. That becomes our voice that we then can share with the world. And if you're at a place and you're like, oh, maybe I'll do it later. Oh, right now I really want you to sit with those excuses, acknowledge them as excuses, and recognize that if you're ready, if you're called to this work, then it is the time now. And no matter what feels like it's in your way, it's actually not. If it's the money, there's payment plans. If it's the time, you just have to make the time. That's what life is. It's only time and energy. We have to prioritize it. And I definitely, I'm calling in the committed here. I'm calling in the people who want to show up for their magic, but just need the structure. They just need the guidance. And that's what the Witch Codes is for. It's for people who just are ready to receive it and to alchemize it into the change that they need it to be for their lives.
And that's so powerful for the individual to look at the shadow behind the excuses and dissolve those, resolve them, to find power in them. Okay, I know I have this excuse: money, time, attention, crazy life. I've heard them all. Honestly, I've made them up.
My husband doesn't want me to do it. I love that one.
That one's really good. Like, really?
Speaking to the ones out there, if your only reason for not doing something is because you don't know how to bring it up to your partner, that's more reason to do it. Because at the end of the day, if that's a strong relationship, it shouldn't matter. Right. No matter what their opinion is. Yes. And it also should not be what holds you back from living your actual life.
Your authentic life.
On. Yeah. Come on. I mean, I've heard it all, but it just really, I'm really speaking to the ones who feel like their husband is their keeper. And you know what's funny about that is I've met a lot of these husbands, and that's actually not true. It is something women put on their husbands, that they don't want them to do the thing that makes them independent, because you're a bit afraid.
It's scary. Yeah. It's scary. It is. And let's acknowledge that. Like, stepping out of the comfort zone is scary.
Oh, it is so terrifying. So scary. You feel naked.
Yes. And being seen, it makes you so vulnerable, or feel vulnerable. But right now, in the state that we're in, we need the people who are able to step up. We need we need you to step up, because our community needs you. Yeah. Elise and I can only do so much. We can impart our knowledge. We can impart our experience. We can talk about it forever on the podcast. But really what it boils down to is it comes down to you. You hold the power, whether you're afraid to admit it or not, or want to admit it or not. You hold the power. You hold the key to your future. And we can give you the tools. We can give you the structure. We can give you the knowledge. But that's all we can do for you. We can't do it for you. And we can't. One of my shadows wrapped up in being seen was that I didn't want to be put on that pedestal. I didn't want to be the one that was looked up as being the Messiah or, whatever, however you want to word that. And that terrified me because I don't like that persona. I am not the be all end all. None of us are, but you are for yourself.
Yeah.
You have to be that for yourself. Nobody can tell you what's right for you, what's wrong for you. And that's where the structure is necessary, because we get all these little bits of information from the stratosphere, from YouTube, from TikTok, from wherever, and we're overwhelmed by it. How do we organize that? How do we structure it? How do we use it to our advantage? And so programs like what we're offering gives you that structure. It allows you to explore these aspects and then decide, okay, that worked for me. I'm going to keep that.
Yeah.
But this over here, not so much. I'm going to, maybe table that or put it on a shelf, and maybe sometime in the future, I can utilize that. Maybe even just utilize it to help someone else step into their authenticity. And that's really what it's all about, is that you have to make that decision to show up for yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. And once you do, and that's the power of containers. Container sounds weird. Like, it's like, what does that mean? And it wasn't until I stepped into one that I understood it. So I'll do my best to explain it. But basically, the course, the Witch Codes is a safe space. But more than that, think of it as a literal container. It is an actual vessel that holds and supports us. It's a foundation. It is a space of its own. Yes. And within that, in the WhatsApp group, where we network with each other and we get to know each other, we share our wisdom, we ask our questions. We are all working individually and as a group towards the same goal, towards stepping into our power as witches. And so that gets amplified. Every time somebody in that container does a ritual, everybody benefits. Every time somebody in that container reads a book, everybody learns something. It is unreal. It is truly hard to put into words, like any good spiritual experience, how fast the connections are made. Like my first container, I moved through shadows that I didn't even know I still was moving through. Yeah. But I sealed them up. I finished them off. I checked the box. It was so powerful. I released so many fears. And every container I join, I go through something more powerful than the last. It's unreal. It truly is hard to put into words what it does for you. So it might sound like 2 months out, and you might say, oh, well, in 2 months, I've been able to learn how to cast a circle. Well, you're going to learn how to cast a circle. You're going to learn how to raise energy in multiple ways. You're going to learn how to direct that energy into multiple spells. By the end of this container, you will feel so confident in your spellcraft that things that feel stressful now, things that feel like fears now, how am I going to pay for that? How am I going to make it to that? How am I not going to disappoint her? Those things fall away. Yeah. They simply fall away, and all that's left is your power. And it's such a powerful trust in yourself that flows through you. It's it's hard to put into words, but it is real. It's so real, and it changes your reality in the best ways.
I'm just laughing right now because I'm looking at the time, and we literally expected this to be like a quick catch up, and we just started talking. We always do that. I love it. I
know. It's our biggest passion, and these are the conversations we just have. It's like, how can we best serve? And that's at the end that's the core of it is like, there's so much to share and learn and gain. And I see the differences. Like, I think of who I was before I found witchcraft, and the fear that drove my life. Like, you don't even know it until you turn to that shadow.
You become accustomed to it. It just becomes part of your everyday until you really turn around and look at it. And you're like, oh shit, that's there.
Mhm.
I need to fix that.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's
Like
holding me
this whole
back.
election season, like
Oh
people
my
are
gosh.
they're just living in fear because
The
they
terror.
feel like there's
Yes.
no control in their lives, you know? Like just getting the junk mail here is
Yeah.
unbelievable.
Oh my gosh. And
Like
the
I
phone
get like,
calls and the text messages.
yeah, it makes you feel like you have no control over your life. But
Right.
the reality is that is temporary and it is not actually
Yes.
affecting us.
Yeah.
It's not.
Yeah.
We can't
It's
let
not.
our lives go on hold because of, you know, junk
Some
mail.
uncertainty in the political stratosphere. Yeah.
Yeah. It's
And-
always
and ev-
uncertain.
Yeah. And I mean, I think a lot of people fear like as soon as one person or another is elected, like all of a sudden their life is going to drastically change. But that's not true. Like it does
No.
take time. There's, they can't just instantly flip a switch and everybody loses their job or everybody loses their mind. I don't know.
Mhm.
Well, that second one might happen.
Yeah. Yeah. But we won't lose our minds. You know,
No,
like
we won't,
when we're
because we're
tapped into our
witches.
power. Yeah.
Exactly.
Like nothing can hit us. Like it's unbelievable how unstoppable we find ourselves when we find our power.
Yes. Yes. You just got to tap into that.
Mhm.
Accept it.
It's waiting
Embrace
for you.
it. It is.
Christopher Penczak is an award-winning author, teacher, and healing practitioner. As an advocate for the timeless perennial wisdom of the ages, he is rooted firmly in the traditions of modern witchcraft and earth-based religions, but draws from a wide range of spiritual traditions, including shamanism, alchemy, herbalism, theosophy, and Hermetic Kabbalah, to forge his own magical traditions. His many books include Magic of Reiki, Spirit Allies, The Mystic Foundation, and The Inner Temple of Witchcraft. He is the co-founder of the Temple of Witchcraft Tradition, a not-for-profit religious organization to advance the spiritual traditions of witchcraft, as well as the co-founder of Copper Cauldron Publishing, a company dedicated to producing books, recordings, and tools for magical inspiration and evolution. He has been a faculty member of the Northeastern Institute of Whole Health and a founding member of the Gifts of Grace, an interfaith foundation dedicated to acts of community service, both based in New Hampshire. He maintains a teaching and healing practice in New England, but travels extensively lecturing. More information can be found at ChristopherPenczak.com, and we will put that link in the show notes.
Hey, welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here.
I am too, because I got to meet you in person at Temple Fest. Your group invited me to come as a presenter, and it's been one of those moments where you get to meet one of your idols, one of the people you learned from. Like I just showed you like my stack of books here that are just worn because of all the years that I've gone back to them.
They're well loved.
And
I love a well-loved book.
Well loved, absolutely. The Witch's Shield was probably one of my favorites, and you even like included the CDs with them when before we had these online downloads and stuff. And that's still my favorite way to go. But when I got to meet you, I was trying so hard not to fangirl because I'm like, oh my god, I get to meet him. And I was absolutely blown away by the weekend. So our listeners, I'm going to speak to you directly right now. If you ever get a chance to go to Temple Fest, do it. It is an amazing festival. It's run by the Temple of Witchcraft, and everyone there is wonderful. They're so kind. They're so knowledgeable. It is definitely those places you go to grow. Mm-hmm. And I was so excited to be there. And the weekend was it was amazing. So when you agreed to be on the podcast, I'm like, yay! I get to introduce our listeners to you.
Hey. Well, thank you. I'm so excited to be on. And it's really great to have some quiet time to chat because I know at Temple Fest, I'm kind of running around crazy. Yeah. So I know we had a chance to visit a little bit, but I didn't spend that much time in the vendor's hall and I didn't get to your presentation. So it's great to see you.
Thank you. Yeah. It was great because we got to sit and chat over meals. And so I love the communal aspect of it. And I think that's what you have really advocated for your entire career of witchcraft is community. So to introduce those of our listeners who don't know you, can you give us, I don't know, go back to like 20 years. I don't know how far you want to go back, but I mean, literally I don't know how many, you have so many books. I couldn't even count. And tell our listeners about you. What do you stand for? What is your evolution and how did you come up with what you do?
I think the guiding force of everything I do is I create the things that I wished I had. So, I wanted deeper magical training. And I started we were talking a little bit before we started recording about Salem, Massachusetts, and that's where I got my roots. And there was a lot of really knowledgeable people there. And I got some really quick, intensive, and life-changing training there. But I wanted more. And I started studying with some other witches and found that I still wanted more. So I started looking, particularly healing really called to me. So I started getting involved in more alternative healing and things like Reiki and herbalism and flower essences. And between that and the witchcraft, that led me to a lot more spirit-oriented work, and what we might think of as shamanism or core shamanism today. I got deeply involved in the New Age community, which seems a little strange for some people, but they had healing techniques that worked. So I wanted to know why, but then they often couldn't answer my questions. That's the big thing. I think I'm always the kid in the back of the class with the hand raised saying, why does this work? Or how does this work? Yeah. And when people can't answer that, then I have to go on a quest myself. So that sort of led me to theosophy and the origins of a lot of New Age traditions, and saw how that dovetailed back into the 18th century with occultism and spiritualism, which led me back to witchcraft. And then I tried to kind of really incorporate all those different influences. And I think, although witch is my primary way of looking at the world and the lens and the way I identify, I'm also an occultist. And I know some people love that word and some people hate that word, but I think it's almost like the scientific aspect of witchcraft and magic. So being raised Catholic and coming from a very kind of dogmatic perspective and cultural perspective, I went to an all boys Catholic school for high school and had lots of fights in my religion class with why this doesn't make sense. I'm always looking for things to show up in more than one place. So I'm not particularly rooted in any one culture. My original teachers were very Celtic, although they had some Egyptian influence. As you get into all the things that I've studied, you start to see the things that are the same everywhere in the human condition. And then you start to see how they're different, like certain core ideas expressed differently in the Middle East because it's a desert than they do in the Mediterranean because that's much more bountiful, or they're going to, appear different places in northern colder climates than they are in warmer climates. But there's core ideas and core images and core archetypes that keep showing up. So I'm always looking for what shows up in more than one place. And I think that might be a truth. And then I try to work it into my own practice, and then realizing other people want to go deeper too. I don't want them to have to always do the same quest I did. So I start to kind of coalesce that and synthesize that and shape it into a different teaching. So at first I was really just about the education, and I was just about, sharing that education. And my original view of I think of the Temple of Witchcraft as my life's work. And the start of it was the classes and then the books. I just wanted to put the books out in the world and use them, don't use them, however, change them, adapt them, whatever. But then I found people were also really looking for community. And there was this archetype in, I won't even say early, I'm going to say 1980s, 90s Wicca, of we're the inheritors of this great ancient priesthood. And then you get to the mid 90s and scholars are like, oh, it's not really the way that you were taught, or this might not be real, which caused a lot of my peers to reject it. And that was very heartbreaking for me because I guess maybe I never took it as such a literal truth. And if you look at a lot of the founding myths of any of the great religions, things that we claim as history today, like we come from a culture that looks at a lot of Old Testament myths as history, as fact, even though we can't always prove them. I think as a young tradition, as a young neo-pagan witchcraft Wiccan religion, I think that was part of our founding myths. And I think the divorce from that ancient priesthood caused a lot of people to go off the rails. Because you'll notice at that point, a lot of people got very curse happy, as I like to say, or became very gray ethically, and they would do things with magic that they might not necessarily do in real life. And I think that caused a lot of twisting. And not that there's not always an issue of ego expansion and delusion in magic at all times, but I think it got worse in the early 2000s, just because I think a lot of those guardrails and traditions being passed in community started to dissolve. I love that there's so much information available to people, but I think it also, for those of us who are raised in a little bit more of a traditional setting in occultism, it was weird to watch. And I think I always wanted that illustrious priesthood that stretched back to the ancient world. So rather than claim it as a literal fact, I just tried to create a community of priesthood that could work and support the greater world, could support each other, and could sort of guard and evolve and create new mythos for the new age and new teachings for new people. So I tried to create the thing that I felt was missing.
And I think you've been successful. Absolutely.
I completely agree.
I appreciate
know.
that. I appreciate that. Yeah.
And I know in my community, like that's one thing that people are still seeking. They're seeking community. They're seeking direction. They say they want to be solitary. They say they want that freedom to do whatever they want, whenever they want. But then there's that, what happens, I see, and what is expressed is they have this disconnection. They don't know what direction they're going. They don't know what's right, what's wrong for themselves. And that's what I like, what you advocate for is that idea of you take the similarities and bring them together. What makes sense across the board? And there's where you find that your kernel of truth, and you can dig into that. I was just talking to one of my students about how she feels like there's so much out there. She doesn't know what to focus on. So I'm coaching her through trying to really hone in on that. What would you say to one of your students who feels like there's so much, they want to do it all, they think they have to be a master at it all at once? What is your advice to them?
We actually have a saying in the temple. We talk about how we live in the age of the great blessing and the great curse. And the great blessing is never before we had access to all this information and mythology and folklore and magic and language. And the great curse is never before we had access to all this folklore and magic and because it pulls you out of a context. If you don't have a cultural context, you have to look at all the different meanings of an animal omen. If you don't have a cultural context, you have to look at all the different meanings of a plant and then figure out what does that mean to you, which I think is good. I think it's part of the Aquarian blessing and burden, but for the student that's really struggling with that, I'm always big about patterns. I think the way people get stuck, and I'm a little, I say this with love, I'm a little magpie, a little crow at heart. I like to pick at the things that are shiny and, look very wonderful. But I think you have to follow a pattern to then understand how to build your own pattern. And a lot of people unconsciously are trying to build their own pattern and never having experienced it before. So I think it's good to, if you have a book that's a textbook, follow the textbook all the way through to the end, even if you don't like it, just to say I've done many courses that I thought sucked, but I wanted to see if there was gold at the end. And sometimes there was, and it was my struggle was the learning of it. And sometimes there wasn't, but follow a pattern. So like the books that I try to put out, both the series and the temple, and then just individual books, the more I write and the more I teach, the more each book is like a little grimoire to be worked through. And there's a definitive theme and there's a beginning, middle, and end. And if you follow it through, and then at the end, you can figure out, all right, I'm going to take this part, or I'm going to take this experience and try to bring it into my own context. But it is a struggle. Like even in our temple training, there's 5 degrees to it in the initial training. And if you get to the 4th degree, the challenge, the final project is you have to create a reality map. And people hear that and they freak out because they're like, well, how am I going to make a map of reality? I'm like, all the things you've learned, how do they fit together? So even what you create this year is not going to be your ultimate reality, but now you know the skills of map making. So you can understand patterns and you can figure out if new things fit the pattern, if you're always missing something and didn't know it, or how you can synthesize your experiences. But I think following a pattern, whether it's an elemental pattern, a planetary pattern, an alchemical pattern, a myth that you're going to follow the stages of the myth, a psychological pattern, pick a pattern and try to figure out, try to work it and see if there's gold at the end of it. And sometimes there's not. Sometimes you're like, oh, that was a big waste of time. But I think that's also the part of research, like everything's not going to yield a brilliant experience, but if you don't try it, you'll never know.
Ooh, that is such a key thing right there. Not everything is going to yield a brilliant experience, because I think that's what everybody's looking for. We're all magpies, I think, at heart.
And I think people are afraid to fail too. People think I'm going to do it once. And that's honestly running a school that has deadlines and assignments. And it's not just we have some programs that are do as you will and just take it for fun. But we have other programs that are very regimented, and people sometimes say, oh, well, witchcraft shouldn't be regimented, and why are you telling me what to do? I'm like, you signed up for this. I didn't sign up. I didn't seek you out. You sought me out, and this is the pattern of it. And I know if you follow the pattern in this time and in the sequence to the best of your ability, I know through teaching it for 30 years, something good will happen to you. If you don't want to follow that pattern, that's okay. But people will do an exercise once and they'll be like, yeah, I didn't do that well. And that's their homework. I'm like, all right, well, I did that exercise. Like even just basic stuff, people, because social media and wonderful videos and things like that, people will hear someone's peak experience and think that that should be everybody's daily practice.
Right.
And so I remember sitting in front of a candle for 3 months and nothing happening, but that was part of the focus and the concentration. And people sit before front of a candle now, and if their ancestors don't give them, some secret knowledge that only they possess, then they think that they failed in some way. And I'm like, I think it's very helpful for people who practice magic to also study an art. Because I think if you study music or drawing or dance or, clay, sculpting, anything like that, you realize many of your attempts for the first few years aren't going to be great. But you don't build up the skills unless you get that. And even things you think great might not be great in the big scheme of things, but they're great for you in that moment, and take that win, take that peak. But I sucked at playing scales for a number of years on the piano, and I still am not a great pianist right now. But that idea of just struggling and doing basic exercises to get the techniques down, I think, is sometimes dismissed. And I think part of my work is trying to preserve that. If you don't want to do it, you don't have to. But when you do want to do it, have a place where someone can guide you through that process.
Yeah, and like we always come back to, witchcraft is orthopraxic. It is active. You have to do it.
You have to.
You have to practice, and it's experiential. And so many people are afraid to do the magic.
Right.
They don't want to try it, or they try it, and like you said, maybe they deem it a failure, which there is no such thing. I don't think even a spell that doesn't work wasn't a failure, because it was an experience.
Yeah, you learn something.
Yep, and you learn from it. Absolutely. So interesting you brought up the idea of the practice of an orthopractice. I find I struggle with those, and I feel like witchcraft is an identity. It's a huge part of my identity. And sometimes I make the joke, which as a queer man often gets misunderstood, because I'll say being a witch is sort of like being queer, which when I say that, people will say, oh, you're saying every witch has to be queer? No. And it was so funny talking to a student of mine, one of the few straight male students I have, and he feels like he's such a minority. And I said, go back 30 years, I was the minority, not you. It's interesting how it shifted. Before, all the men in Wicca were straight. It was a very, very fertility
painfully
dynamic.
Straight. It was problematic for women.
So it was just a very, very different dynamic. But a lot of people today now think, because it's so identity based, that once they identify as being a witch, whatever they're interested in is witchcraft. And they don't necessarily have to practice to still speak with authority for witchcraft community, which I find bizarre sometimes. So I'm always like, oh, well, what do you do with that? Or how does that apply to your life? I always try to bring it back to the actual experience. So I love that you said it's about the practice, because I'm right on with you.
Definitely.
Yeah. And it's kind of funny, because I feel like you were saying about this lineage, because people are often, I think with social media, like people are kind of forgetting that it in a way, like we're doing this shift, we're doing this dance, we're doing the spiral dance back and forth between, does lineage matter? Does it not matter? Like, I think, like you said, like and for a bit of background, my master's degree was tailored towards syncretism and in spiritual practices. And so I sort of, in the end, was able to curb it into a study of witchcraft, which was really fun. So I basically mostly focused on like 1880 to present to look at how we got to where we are today. And something I noticed is that in early witchcraft, and same with even druidry, like Ross Nichols and Gardner, and, these people that were sort of establishing alternative spiritualities in the 20th century, they were touting that it was an ancient lineage continued. Right. And then, like you said, it sort of fell apart in the 90s. Solitary practitioners started to be more of a thing. And then people started questioning if it's even worth it to study. And so now we're even in a place where people don't see the value of a coven at all, or they don't understand that in-person ritual is different. Like, it's true that online is a gift. I mean, 100% it is. Like, we're not lying to people when we say that you can get a lot out of an online course. But when you stand in physical circle with people, it cannot be replaced. It's just the facts. Like, and people will, just kind of poo-poo either experience then. They're like, well, I won't do an online thing and I won't do an in-person thing, so I'll just be alone. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is, in a funny way, we have a way now to signal to those ancient cultures again, because that's what we can do today when we go to Temple Fest, or when we go to Paganicon, or, Sacred Space, or we're actually kind of mimicking what the ancients did, like at least in Greece. Like when I think of the earth priestess arts that have been lost in Greece, that I'm really focused on reviving and being a part of the rebirth for. They were personal 90% of the time, but about 10% of the time you had these festivals and gatherings where you did go and stand in circle, metaphorically or literally. Maybe it was as a Maenad, you went into the forests like my ancestors did in Arcadia, and, you know, who knows what they did out there, but they had some community, you know, these women, or maybe it was in Athens. Yeah, we don't want to know. They came back bloody and naked. So actually, I do want to know.
It's kind of interesting to figure it out. I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, you know, and then in Athens, it was a little more quote unquote civilized, and they would maybe be putting the Himation on Athena, but you'd have thousands of people gathering. The Eleusinian Mysteries, those were people gathering from as far as Arcadia, as far as there's even theories that they were coming from Bulgaria, modern day Thrace, for the Eleusinian Mysteries. But what were they doing in between those festivals? They were on their own. So we kind of know what it all looks like now. Like we know what it's like to like hold literally to the need for a lineage, and to hold loosely to the need for a lineage, and to say screw the lineage completely. And so we can actually maybe now move on fully and have it all.
I'm a big believer in spiritual lineage versus literal lineage. Although I think I honor all the teachers I've had and all the initiations I've had. But, you know, as an occultist, I look at even a lot of non-pagan things. I think of the Christian and Jewish and Muslim occult movements that then informed the rebirth of Wicca. And I see those as my spiritual ancestors, maybe not my spiritual practices or beliefs, but I see a lot of the old alchemists speaking the same universal truths, even though they might be talking about gold as Christ. You know, that's not my interpretation of it, but I get what they're saying. And just like when they were looking to the ancient Egyptian and Greek alchemists, you know, they weren't using Christ, but they could be like, oh, I get what they're saying. Every age kind of reinvents the mysteries. I think having spiritual roots are really important, and to disconnect completely from the ancestors is a mistake, in my opinion. But I think you also have to realize, like I studied with a lot of Celtic Reconstructionists, and I was sort of always banging the drum of like, yep, I don't live in a tribe in Britain right now. Like I don't live in a roundhouse. I don't, you know, even kind of hearkening back to pre-British Isles Celtic traditions and what was going on in the Danube River Basin and what was going on in Gaul and what kind of predated all the language divides. I still don't live there. You know, so what does this look like as someone who's studying Celtic tradition, who's of Italian, Greek, Lithuanian, and Polish descent, you know, a little Danish in there too. Like what does that look like for who's living in America, who doesn't really know more than 2 generations of ancestors back by name? Like, what does that look like? I have to kind of connect to those spiritual ancestors. I think that's why I was very attracted to what we call, and what a lot of witchcraft traditions call, the mighty dead, or the timeless tradition, sort of the enlightened ancestors of the craft. When I got involved in all those New Age traditions, and they were doing a lot with the ascended masters, and those particular teachers like to focus on the popular ones. So it was Kuan Yin, and particularly for the goddess ones I worked with, it was Kuan Yin, it was White Buffalo Woman, it was Mother Mary, and all these different forms of it. And they do the meditations, and I was like, oh, I got a little woman in a hut in Greece. You know, I got a little Egyptian priestess. I got a woman in Cornwall. And they're like, oh, no, that's not right. But over time, I realized, oh, those were the enlightened ancestors of my spiritual lineage. So we're tapping into the ascended masters. What does that look like for a witch? What does that look like for a healer? And I saw them as spiritual priesthood, even though the little cunning woman from Cornwall would not have considered herself a priestess, but I do. You know, but that's a controversial point, and I get that. But also, as a witch, I think it's okay to be controversial. Sometimes
we very have much to be. We're witches.
Place of don't offend anybody, or make sure whatever you say is 100% backed up by every scholar, and don't do this and don't do that. I mean, there's certain truths I hold that we might never prove, but they're the truths I hold, and as long as I demonstrate them in teachings to say this is a truth I hold, or this is my gnosis, or this is my experience, or this is what was taught to me, but academia might say this, I'm okay running counter to things, because I think sometimes the point of the witch is to run counter.
Yes. Yeah. We got to be. We're in the liminal. We have to be comfortable being countercultural.
Yeah.
Especially, I think that's something I love about witchcraft, is that it's grown to be a safe place for people who are on the margins in any number of ways.
Although I also like to emphasize, this might be a little controversial for people as well, that witchcraft isn't safe. I like to create community that's welcoming and has structure and guidelines and safety rails. But I think if people tell you that magic is safe, they're probably lying or don't know, because I think magic's always changed. I think change is always dangerous. And I think there's always a chance you're not going to get what you want. You're going to set things into motion that you didn't anticipate. Ultimately, I truly feel all of those things are good, but good is different from safe.
Sure. So I've shared this on the podcast before. So some listeners are probably like, oh, here she goes. But
well, I want to hear
in the Lord of, I think you'll like this. So in the Lord of the Rings, as they're entering Lothlorien in the Fellowship, they are, Gandalf has fallen and they're entering Lothlorien. Aragorn is leading them and he's super pumped. Legolas is pumped, but Boromir is scared shitless. And he's like, I've heard that the lady is a witch and that it is a perilous realm. Oh, I get full body goosebumps every time I think about this. And Aragorn says, of course it is perilous, because nobody who enters will emerge unchanged. And that is how I see witchcraft. It is perilous. You will not do witchcraft. You will not be a witch. You will not stand before an altar and then step away unchanged. But that's why we stepped forward anyway.
Exactly.
Absolutely. It gives me shivers and connections to the whole Arthurian perilous chapel and the idea that the quest changes you. The very nature of faring forth changes you. Absolutely. I love that. I'm a Lord of the Rings geek, but I did not realize that quote, so I'm gonna have to look that up.
Yeah. It's
we
could, that's a whole, that could be a long talk.
Well, and just to add to that, one of the one tradition that I'm initiated into is a Tolkien tradition. That was our mythology. We followed the Tolkien mythos, and Galadriel was always our catalyst. Like, we always looked at her as she could be the great terrifying storm or the peaceful resolve. So stepping into Lothlorien was one of those things where you're like, okay, I'm going here to change. I'm going here to evolve. And that's always how I looked at witchcraft. It is a path of evolution. We should always be looking to evolve, to change our mind about things that we were so set on. And that has been my evolution. Things that I believed 20 years ago to be the right way, the exact way, the way that I should follow my path, don't apply anymore. I'm a different person. Therefore, my path is different. And that's to me the model that I follow with witchcraft.
You may have noticed that here at the Magic Kitchen podcast, we don't have sponsored ads. That's because this is a fully listener-supported show. We do what we do for you, dear listener, and when you join my magical living community on Patreon, you're supporting all the time and energy that goes into setting up podcast interviews, writing articles and rituals, my paranormal mystery novel, and all that I do. If you love this podcast, consider joining my magical space. I can't wait to meet you and be an even bigger part of your magical journey. Go to patreon.com/Elise Wells or follow the link in the show notes. So, since Samhain is around the corner as this episode is coming out, would you have anything to share about how Samhain is celebrated today that maybe is so different from when you first sort of jumped into the craft? And like, maybe what do witches today not know about how Samhain is celebrated, or about the thinning veil, or about all the things people think of at this time of year?
That's fascinating. So I would say the biggest change from when I first started practicing is that Samhain is sort of extended to the whole year now, which I sort of love. But the idea of the ancestors becoming so important over the whole year has really expanded. And when I started, it was really just this time of year, and then people sort of forgot the ancestors, or at least we're not actively working with them. And now that it seems to be like somewhere along the shift, and I know I shifted it as well, the idea of having the ancestors out on your main altar for this month versus having an ancestral altar all year round. And now I have an ancestor altar all year round. That probably started in the early 2000s. So I'd say that was probably an influence from people in neo-paganism from the African traditional religions. That's really how it came into our community, because we had a lot of crossover with that. And that really shifted my view and my work with the ancestors. I love the idea of the veil thinning. And sometimes people will say, oh, that's not really true. Or some people in the modern era where the world is just crazy say the veil is shredded all the time. And this is, a difficult, horrible place. I don't know if I believe it's a difficult world right now, but I don't think that's because of the veil. I do think that the idea of the veil thinning, I'm a very astrological witch. So I think when the sun starts moving towards Scorpio, there's a natural thinning, there's a natural connection to the underworld and to the dead. I think also from a biological model, as a lot of things are dying, even if we're not sacrificing the herd in the way that they did in ancient times, and I'm not personally sacrificing it, and there's animal death throughout the whole year. I get that from manufactured farming. But the idea of everything in the northern hemisphere starting to wither, I think that life force goes within, and the gates have to get wider for that. So whether you think of it as a veil thinning or the gates opening, I think autumn generally kind of brings that. And I think that tradition, when we look at places that had different seasons, like the Sumerian season of the ancestors started in what we think of as August, but it was a time of withering. When we look at the Egyptian calendar, it's instead of 4 seasons of 3 months, it's 3 seasons of 4 months. But when they have the withering, that was a time of the dead and the ancestors and Osiris. So I think whenever vegetation is withdrawing, that opens the veil. So I think that's a big part of it. It's interesting in witchcraft and paganism today, a lot more about mediumship has become big. Like when I began, it was a little aspect of it. People would speak to the dead, but it was much more of a personal thing. And you'd speak to your dead through tarot cards and divination. And now a lot of people want to have psychics speak through them or have the ancestors overshadow or possess them in some way and kind of come through, or the ancestors of tradition speak to the community, which was less popular then, I guess, or less seen in the public. And now you see that a lot more. So I love those aspects of it, and the idea that the ancestors are just more prominent and with us. And I think, a shift, I mentioned this before with the mighty dead, but I think there's a much greater emphasis on the ancestor of witches and what we like to refer to as the witch soul and the collective consciousness of witches. I think before it was such a focus on blood family, and now the idea of ancestors expanding out to include ancestors of place and ancestors of adoption and ancestors of story and ancestors of tradition. I think it widens it for those of us who might have had traumatic experiences with blood family and don't want to connect. Although even the idea that some of my strongest blood ancestors are like Neolithic, they jump over a lot of the generations of my family and kind of go into this primal thing, but I feel them in my blood. They're not just in my spirit. So I think that's shifted too. People weren't really talking about that.
That's amazing.
That's interesting.
I love that.
Yeah.
And speaking of different kinds of ancestors, part of what I follow in my tradition is we view the trees and the mycelial networks as the ancestors, the earth ancestors. So I'm glad you brought that up, because it's not always just blood. It's not always just this tangible thing that we can relate to. Sometimes it's so intangible and so, I don't know, out there to some perspectives.
We have a teaching on the divine mothers, and we divide the mother into 9 aspects or 9 mothers. And one of the mothers is just referred to as the first mothers. And they're the first cells, so pre-animal, pre-plant, pre-fungus, pre-bacteria. What were the first kind of primordial soup? Those are the first ancestors, biological ancestors. And so we look at those as a type of mother that guides us through it. And then we have other mothers that deal with plant and animal life and things like that. But those first mothers are the first cells upon the earth.
Yeah. Oh, that's powerful.
Very, very powerful. I love it.
Yeah. I think for me, the shift in my ancestor work this month is away from, I'm very fortunate that, well, I say this. It was unfortunate at the time. It's very fortunate now. But my grandmother, who I was extremely close to, died when I was 5. And when she died, as she was dying, it was one of these long illnesses, and we knew it was coming. But she had gone to New Mexico and Arizona, and I was 5, so I don't know exactly what she did, but she did some work with shamans. I know she did some spiritual work, and she came back with blessed turquoise and some crystals, and she gave them to me, and she told me, I will guide you. I will be with you more. Let's not get emotional here. I tell this story to people a lot. I don't know why. It always gets me. But she has, and she told me I'll come as a butterfly. And so she has. And there's been times where I'm even swimming in the sea. I'm hundreds of meters from the shore, and a butterfly shows up in the sea a living butterfly. Like, so she has kept her promise with me. And so she's with me all year. But this month my ancestor work shifts, and I try to work with her lineage. Like, you know, she's my mom's mom. So she carried me in her womb. Like, I think of that constantly, like that matrilineal line. And so that's kind of how I use is such a utilitarian word. I don't love it, but you know, that's how I use the veil at this time, is to really follow that line. But the rest of the year for me is really about land. You know, I spend most of my year in Greece. This year I'm going to be in the US for a little bit. But when I go to the US, it's the land she was raised on. It's the land I was raised on as a kid. So I feel blessed. Again, it's that liminal space I find myself in. I feel blessed that I get to have two places where my heart feels so grounded and connected. But it does kind of, I like thinking of it as ancestor work. You know, it's more than just the now. It's not just, okay, you know, how do I grocery shop in this country versus that? Like, there's an acclimation level of the mundane, but there's also like a spiritual grounding that needs to happen. And actually, today is my first day. I got food poisoning my very first day back, which one of my friends was like, that's a very spiritual purge you needed to do, I think. And I was like, I think so, because I had not eaten anything different from my husband who traveled with me, my brother who was also with us. So I have no idea what got me. So it did feel a bit spiritual, albeit uncomfortable. So today, after this recording, I'm actually going to go out and just literally spend the entire day with the land. Like, that is it. That is what I'm going to do. And I'm going to ground. I'm going to lay on the ground. I'm going to get dirt on my clothes and in my hair, and probably bugs and probably weird bites that I don't know where they're from. And that's where witchcraft isn't safe sometimes too.
Absolutely. We do a lot of work in the land here in the Northeast has poison ivy, and that's just the issue of the Northeast. And people are like, oh, can you guarantee before I come out, can you promise me I'm not going to poison ivy? I was like, no, so don't come out. Like, sometimes I get it, sometimes I don't. We can set the intention for it. I can teach you how to identify it, but sometimes I miss it. So if I miss it and I walk this land, you might miss it too. But yeah, and I think the intersection between land and ancestors, I had a mentor that talked about, if you live in the place, and I know it's a little bit different in the modern era with embalming and coffins and the ways that we do things. But if you live in the land where your ancestors are buried and you're eating the local food, you're essentially eating the ancestors. And there's this kind of old mythology of the spirits of the dead were pushing up the blessings from the underworld, whether that was food, whether that was gems, whether that was metals, whether that was minerals, that there was always that kind of, and that's why you made the offerings, because it was that reciprocity to kind of keep the cycle going. But the idea of eating your ancestors was like, mind blowing for me. And I love that, because I think that's very true and very visceral. And I think at first people can get turned off by that idea, but I think that's also part of witchcraft. And I think that's part of where we're going. When we first got the land here in Salem, New Hampshire for the Temple of Witchcraft, to open up as a religious organization, you have to go through all sorts of hoops and governmental things and boards and all that. And you can imagine, even though this is the town I grew up in, and my family was well known, and there were some difficulties and protests. And it was actually Selena Fox who called me up and said, I want you to go to the oldest graveyard and commune with like the founding fathers of the town, and ask them to explain who you are and why you're here and what good you're trying to do, and make them offerings and ask for their help to kind of get through. And interestingly enough, we had a member who's not that local, but in New Hampshire, drove by. We have a sacred site here called America's Stonehenge, which if you think of Stonehenge, it's not that, but it's a Neolithic site that we don't really know who built, and there's lots of theories. And there's one of the oldest cemeteries is on the way to it. And it's just hidden off the road. It's one of those little forest cemeteries that if you don't see the sign, you'll miss it. And they perceived a ghost on the road and stopped and went into the woods to figure out what is the spirit trying to flag us down. And it was the cemetery that I was going to go to. And we kind of shared notes. We realized a very specific ancestor came forward and wanted to be honored and worked. And he's from the 1700s. And that whole graveyard, we make offerings to the whole graveyard, but particularly to this figure, Samuel. So it's this, other than living here all my life, I don't have a blood connection, but those are my ancestors of place, because this is where I was raised and where I came back to. And it's interesting in a modern witch cult, and cult in the best possible way, not in the derogatory way of it, but the idea of secret practices, the idea of elevated ancestors. And we have this idea of the enlightened ancestors of the ancient past. We have this idea of the recent dead, of who we might have known in life and who we're connected to, blood or spirit, And then how do those become elevated? And it's been a very interesting process of watching. I think of my mom, Rosalie Penczak, was sort of the mother of the temple. Although she passed as we were founding everything, the first core of community was at her house. We used to host these Samhain parties where I would do the ritual and she would do the party, and we did it for 12 years. And by the end, we had like 100 people in her backyard, and sometimes the police would show up wanting to know what was going on. Our neighbors, I would talk to a little kid at the time who's now all grown up, and he's like, "Your dad is the head Satanist of Salem, right?" I was like, "Nope, actually that'd be me, but not Satanist." It's interesting the stories that get passed around town, I was like, okay. Yeah. But she was really the mother to what this community, turned into, and she gave a lot of counsel and support for people, even though this was not a paying vocation for her. And then when she passed, she started appearing to different members of the temple, and we had a little conversation before she passed, because when you're in a position like I am, everybody likes to give you psychic advice unsolicited, and everyone wants to give you a message. So I said, I really need to know it's you. And she gave me a very specific symbol that she said, I will mention this to whoever I speak to if it's a message for you. And I'd say like 10 times. She passed in 2011. I'd say at least 10 times, different people who didn't really know her. I said, I got a message from your mom. And first she showed me, and it was the image that related, that was the code. And then they gave the message. And I've had a lot of people give me messages that didn't have the code, but when the code kind of came through, and it's been interesting to hear different people who didn't know her feel like she's shown up in spirit as a mother form, and she's offered healing, or they've had a problem, particularly with family stuff. She's very family oriented. And they met her in a meditation and asked for her help, and the thing resolved the next day. So it's interesting to see those kind of living shifts. A little weird too, because it's my mom, but it's very interesting because she was known, and now she's known through others who didn't know her in her life, but know her story. So when she passed in May, it was her birthday, and her death day was just 2 days apart. We do a little feast for her, and we're actually down in New Orleans doing a retreat. Every few years we do a temple retreat in New Orleans, and there's a wonderful medium and ghost tour presenter. Her name is Bloody Mary, and she usually takes us around to the cemeteries and teaches a little bit of New Orleans voodoo to us. And we did a seance, and she brought through my mom, not knowing any of this and not really knowing, I don't even know if she knew my mom had passed or not, but very clearly gave the description and very clearly gave some really intense instructions and had a message to pass on to my dad. It was powerful and wonderful.
It's astonishing. I love it.
That makes me think. So in Greece, where I live on the Temple of Artemis's grounds. Like the town we live in is called Artemis because the Temple of Artemis Stavropoulos is to the west, and then on the east is Brauron, Vavrona, which is. Yeah. I was gonna say, you said you went to Artemis Temple. I bet that was the one. And so, do you remember Iphigenia has her own tomb there? She was the high priestess. Oh. Of the temple. And it was similar. Like she was so good in life at helping women through childbirth, excuse me, that when she passed, people would still pray to her alongside the goddesses. Like she became almost a demigoddess. Oh. So that just reminded me of your mom. Like that's very powerful.
Yeah, I think a lot about, I'm very into sacred geometry and sacred architecture. And I think of like the barrow mounds and the different lodges that they'd have and how they'd find some bones. It wasn't the graveyard for the whole community, but I think often that was a technology for different people who lived to be interfaces with the land. So I think whether it's their graveside or whether it's a barrow mound or, these ancient ancestors that we still venerate. But I think it's interesting to see how things will evolve in witchcraft today for the modern ancestors and, who comes forward and who doesn't. We have another high priest that passed and he shows up a lot, but we've had other members of the community who don't show up to anybody at all. So is it the difference of spiritual power and training? Is it just their desire? Is it their story is a good story, so people latch onto the story? I don't know, but something happens. So I think it's interesting to see how that's going to evolve. And I wonder where we'll be 20 years from now and how people will be looking at it.
Hey there, witches. Did you know that there's an entire community out there dedicated to you and your journey? The Rebel Mystic community is a space where I offer my decades of knowledge and experience to witches just like you. I do this through live events, monthly mentoring, monthly rituals, a book club, and other resources like workbook pages and meditations. There is even a complete self-paced course library you can access. Check the link in the show notes to learn more about this community and how to become a member. Blessed be.
Well, thank you so much for being on the show. This was a fantastic conversation. I have a lot to think about with my land today and lineage. And I hope that this conversation will expand people's thinking about what ancestors can be, what Samhain is about, and actually more broadly, what witchcraft is really about. And we impress this upon listeners a lot, but one more time, everybody, read the books, go beyond social media. Social media is like an amuse-bouche. You know what I mean? It's not even an appetizer. It's like reading the menu on Google Maps before going to the restaurant. Like you have to dive in. And I really encourage people to make the sacrifice that we know it is. It is a sacrifice to travel to a festival or to join a community or, it's a pilgrimage. So it is an offering to spirit and it is worth that offering. And Temple of Witchcraft is quite an incredible place to start your journey if you're curious about the lineage of how we got to where we are today.
Right. And I know a lot of our listeners love the deep conversations that we get into, like this one we just had. They want to get into the nitty gritty of it instead of those superficial personas that are put on with social media or even some books. So if you want to get into more deep philosophical or theological idealism, like definitely pick up these books and start attending the conferences and the classes and that sort of thing, so you can really dig into it and build your own community in your own area or and attend communities elsewhere.
Yeah, I guess if I was going to give any closing thought, I would say whatever you feel is missing in your life, in your community, if no one else is building it, go out and do it.
Right. Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Great advice. So tell listeners where they can connect with the Temple of Witchcraft, and we'll put the links in the show notes too.
Yeah, just the Temple of Witchcraft website is templeofwitchcraft.org. My personal website is just christopherpenczak.com. I try to keep my personal appearances separate from my official temple events. We run a mystery school in the Temple of Witchcraft, and it has an odd schedule. So it's a 12-month course, and we give ourselves some time off in between. So it never starts the same time every year, but generally it starts in the fall. It'll go from fall to fall, and then the next session will go from spring to spring, and then fall to fall, kind of giving us some time off in between. And we do lots of classes that are, I know I talked a lot about the homework things, but we do lots of classes that are just for fun. We've got a Wheel of the Year class coming up. We've got a Path of the Moon class coming up that are all just personal experiences and personal sharing. And we've got an astrology class coming up and, all sorts of other good things, and even advanced training for witches who want to go a little deeper. We've got a whole section of training called the Society of the Temple, which gets more into the mysticism and is actually a 9-year program. So lots of deep things to work with. And we offer Sabbats both in person and online, and book clubs and all sorts of ways to gather. And I guess our big thing is for online community, we've got something called Temple Hearth coming up the first weekend of February, or it might be the last weekend of January for Imbolc. But it's a 3-day festival of just online presenters, primarily featuring people in our community that have gone through the courses. And then we have Temple Fest every late summer, early fall that presents and brings in folks from all over the community. So I'm very excited about that. Next year, our keynote speaker is Ivo Dominguez Jr.
Oh, he's wonderful.
Oh, perfect. We've had him on the show, and that was another one of these wonderfully deep, lineage-filled conversations that if listeners haven't listened, definitely go back.
He's who I go to when I have a problem. So highest recommendation.
Yeah, definitely. Good people. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me on. I had a great time.
Good. Merry meet,
merry part, and merry meet again.
Thank you for joining us on the Magic Kitchen podcast. Please visit my website, leandrawitchwood.com, for news, information, and more episodes.
I'm Elise Wells, and I can be found at Seeking Numina on YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook, and seekingnumina.com. That's Seeking, Numina.